Today I want to share with you how to make 3 healthy make-ahead cake mixes. And these are all shelf-stable pantry staples. We're going to make a chocolate cake mix, we're going to make a yellow cake mix, and I've got a few tips and tricks to share with you for how to use whole grains when making a yellow cake mix. Plus, our 3rd cake mix is going to be a spice cake mix. Hi, sweet friends. I'm Mary, and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, the first healthy make-ahead cake mix that we're going to start with is our chocolate cake mix. Now, we're going to go over the ingredients, but I just want to mention that if you open the description below underneath this video, there'll be a word, it'll say recipe, and next to it will be a link, and that link will take you over to my blog post that corresponds with this video, where you can read the recipe online or you can print it out. And for each of these healthy make-ahead cake mixes, I'll have all the dry ingredients listed, but then I'll also list the wet ingredients that you'll need to turn this into a cake, and then the instructions on how to go ahead and mix it together and bake it up. And each of these make-ahead cake mixes is going to be enough to make 1 cake. And for all 3 of these healthy make-ahead cake mixes, we're going to be using whole grain flours, or at least part whole grain flours. So the shelf life for these make-ahead mixes is going to be about 6 months to 1 year, depending on exactly how you store it. Because you always have to keep in mind that whole grain flours have a shorter shelf life than all-purpose flours. So these don't last as long as those make-ahead mixes that are made with all-purpose flour. Now, the nice thing about working with chocolate, whether you're making a chocolate cake or brownies or chocolate cookies, whatever the case may be, whole grain flours lend themselves so well when baking with chocolate. And so for this recipe, I am using 2 cups of whole wheat flour. And this is just plain whole wheat flour, the common whole wheat flour that you can find at the grocery store. But if you want to use any of the ancient grain whole wheat flours, like whole einkorn flour or whole spelt flour, you can definitely use that here. Plus, if you're one of those folks who enjoys baking with sprouted flours, where I've shown you how to soak and sprout and dry your grain and then make your own homemade sprouted flour, and you want to use sprouted flour in this recipe, you can definitely use that here too. Now, I do want to mention, if you're on the beginning of your journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, you can certainly do half all-purpose flour and half whole grain flour in this recipe. Now, the other ingredients that you're going to need are 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, and 1 teaspoon of salt. Next, you're going to need 3/4 cup of unsweetened cocoa powder. And then you're going to need 2 cups of sugar. Now, let's talk about the sugar. What I've got here is dried cane juice. It's the whole dried sugar cane juice. It's often called sucanat, and that stands for sugar cane natural, sucanat. And it's getting more and more easy to find at local grocery stores. So if you're making the transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you've not yet incorporated whole sugars into your kitchen and into your cooking, that's okay. You can use white sugar here. Because often I find when people are making that transition to a traditional foods kitchen, it's a little easier for them to start with whole grains and then move on to incorporating whole sugars or whole sweeteners. Now, other options, depending on how much you've transitioned into a traditional foods kitchen, you can use maple sugar in here. It's a little lighter, and it imparts an ever so slight maple flavor, but the chocolate is fairly strong, and so it does somewhat overpower it. But if you like maple, that's definitely an option. Another option is coconut sugar, which really, in many ways, has a very similar flavor to sucanat, which really is, you know, it has somewhat of a brown sugar flavor. and that works very well with chocolate. Another option is date sugar, and date sugar also has a flavor very similar to brown sugar and to sucanat and to coconut sugar. So that's another option you can use as well. Then next, and this is 2 cups, but again, I'll have the recipe for you, but I'm not sure if I mentioned, but that is 2 cups of sugar. Now, finally, this is optional, but if you want, you can add 1 teaspoon of instant coffee powder. It can be a regular instant coffee powder or it can be an espresso coffee powder. It depends how strong you like your coffee. But the reason is for adding coffee powder to chocolate recipes is it just helps intensify the flavor a bit. But definitely you can leave this out. But if you want to use if you don't like caffeine and you want to use a decaf instant coffee powder, you can certainly do that. Now you have a couple of options when you're putting all of this together. I know that some people, if you're planning on giving this as a gift, like to put all the different layers of these different ingredients into the jar, and it looks very pretty. My only concern is that this needs to really be blended very, very well. And so I always worry that if I give this to someone as a gift and they dump it into their bowl and don't whisk it really well to make sure that all of the ingredients are well incorporated, that their cake may not come out well. So I generally like to just mix everything up in advance and just put it all mixed together in the jar. But definitely the choice is yours. Now I like to use a fine mesh strainer as I add in all these different ingredients so that I can make sure that there are no little lumps and bumps, so to speak, just to get everything mixed in very well. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my baking powder, and then over here let's sneak in the baking soda. And then we've got our salt, and I'll just give that a little twizzle just to make sure we've got no little lumps. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add in our cocoa powder. And just like with the other ingredients, I'm just going to work this through the fine mesh strainer to make sure that I don't have any lumps of that cocoa powder going down into the bowl. Now, I do like to use coffee powder. I've actually got an espresso powder here. This is the Italian Medaglia d'Oro instant espresso powder. I really like this brand, but you can certainly use whatever you want. And we'll just get that right in, mixed right there on top of our chocolate. Oh, that smells so good. I could use a cup of coffee. Now, a couple of tips I want to talk about when using sugar in these make-ahead mixes. Even if you were using all-purpose flour and white sugar, I would recommend this same trick. And I'd be interested in hearing in the comments below if you have found a difference depending on if you have tried using your sugar in this way. And what I'm talking about is turning whatever sugar you're using into a powdered sugar. So say you were just making an all-purpose cake mix using all-purpose flour and white sugar. Did you find that it mixed up better and created a better cake later on once you added your wet ingredients when you used powdered sugar? And the reason that I've found that powdered sugar works better is because you're not in a situation when you make a make-ahead mix to be able to beat your fat, your butter, whatever you're using with your sugar and help that grainy sugar dissolve before you add in the rest of your wet ingredients. So I have found with just a plain all-purpose make-ahead cake mix, if you use powdered sugar instead of regular white granulated sugar, you're much better off and you get a much better end product. Well, I have found the same to be true with these healthy make-ahead cake mixes. Whatever sugar I'm using, whether it's sucanat or maple sugar or coconut sugar or date sugar, if I turn this into a powdered sugar, I wind up with a better end product. Now you can do this any way that you want. I'm just going to use one of these little spice grinders, but if you've got a regular blender or a high-speed blender or maybe one of those like bullet type blenders that work really well, a lot of people use them to make smoothies, any of those will work at turning any type of sugar, whether a real sugar or a whole sweetener like a maple sugar or a date sugar or a coconut sugar. It will turn any of those sugars into powdered sugar. The only one in which you probably will want to stop and start is if you're using a regular blender. You'll want to probably get your spatula and just, twizzle things around a little just to make sure that everything's fully blended. But those high-speed blenders can usually do it like in 30 seconds, and the same with those, bullet-type blenders. And these little spice grinders work great too. The only difference with these is that you do have to do it in batches. I just wanted to show you a little close-up picture of the difference between what the whole sucanat looks like before it's ground and then once it's ground. So as you see, it's a lot smoother. There's quite a difference, and it's going to blend so much better with the other dry ingredients. Well, I've got all my sucanat ground, and so now I'm just going to use my fine mesh sift or my fine mesh strainer to sift the last little bits of all of this into my mix. Alrighty, now that we have all of our dry ingredients together, we're going to really whisk this together very, very well so that everything's incorporated and that you don't see any little white bits of baking powder or baking soda. Those are the most important, that you really want to make sure that they're well incorporated, because if they're not and you went ahead and used this mix, you'd get like little pockets of holes or pockets of baking soda or baking powder in your cake, and you don't want that to happen. So just take your time at this step and make sure you really incorporate well. Alrighty, just keep whisking this around very well until you make sure that you don't see any little white bits. And what is so beautiful about this looks like you may have just opened up a box of cake mix from the store. It's beautifully smooth, and that's because we ground up the sugar. Whether, as I said, whether it's a white sugar or the sucanat, the dried cane juice, it just looks so much more like a cake mix when you put your sweetener into a powdered form. And when you get accustomed to mixing these up together, you never have to buy a box cake mix again. And you've got a healthier version than what you could buy at the store. Next, to store this in your pantry or to give it as a gift, you're going to need a quart-sized jar. And I'm going to use a little funnel here to make this a bit easier and neater, hopefully. And I'm just going to start scooping the mix down into my jar. And periodically, just to make sure that everything can fit, I like to give the jar a little shake to just help compress the mixture, get all the air out. Now, when you get everything into this jar, it's going to be filled right to the rim. And as I said, just shake it as you're filling it or tap it a bit to help everything settle. But when you're all done, it should be filled right to the rim. So you won't get any settling once you put this in your pantry or when you give it as a gift. It looks very nice and full. As I like to say, very abundanza. Now, if you're using a canning jar, you can just use the canning lid and the canning ring that came with your jar and just store it like this or give it as a gift like this. But if you want, you could also use one of the storage lids that are made for canning jars. You've got just your average regular white storage lid, or Ball has these new lids that are the leak-proof / airtight lids. Which are very nice too. And so you could do that, whatever you want. Now this is all ready to store in your pantry, and whenever you want to make a chocolate cake, you've got your chocolate cake mix. If you are over on my website, be sure to download my free 36-page pantry list. I list everything out that you can store in your Four Corners pantry. Your main working pantry, your refrigerator, your freezer, and your extended pantry, what we call the prepper pantry. And I have everything pretty much covered in that, along with links to videos that show you how to use the various items, and also little pieces of information about, whole grains or whole sweeteners or, all the different things we talk about in Traditional Foods Kitchen. So I think that you'll like that. Alrighty, now onto our yellow cake mix, and I got a few tips and tricks for you with that one. Now, making healthy make-ahead yellow cake mixes can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge in order to maintain the nice yellow color of a yellow cake. When you go ahead and make the yellow cake, you want your whole grains and your whole sweeteners to be lighter in color so that the yellow of the egg yolks can really shine through and create a lovely yellow cake. But how do you do that? To begin with, you want to use a flour that tends to be lighter in color than your traditional whole wheat flour. Now, most whole wheat flour that's sold at the store in the typical 5-pound bag that says whole wheat flour is made from what's known as red wheat. And that's just the whole grain from which the whole wheat flour is ground is known as red whole wheat. But there's also another grain, and it's wheat, and it's a modern day wheat, and it's known as white whole wheat. Now, is that white whole wheat grain a whole grain? Yes, it is. It's just a different variety than the red whole wheat grain or wheat berry. And that white whole wheat grain, that white whole wheat berry, when it's ground into a flour, it's known as white whole wheat. But it is a 100% whole wheat flour. It's just lighter in color, and it creates a baked good that's lighter in texture, but it's still 100% whole wheat. Now, where can you find whole wheat flour? That's a great question. I've seen it becoming more and more common and is sold at my grocery store, often under the King Arthur brand. Another brand I've seen at my grocery store selling white whole wheat flour is Bob's Red Mill. So when you're at your grocery store, in your baking aisle, look for those brands and see if your grocery store carries the white whole wheat. Because if you can see here, it has a very light color, almost similar to all-purpose flour. But in a way, this works even better for helping you make a nice yellow cake, because the color of white whole wheat flour, or white whole wheat berries once they're ground into white whole wheat flour, is almost a pale yellow color. So white whole wheat flour works very well when making a yellow cake, not only for the color, but also for the fact that it creates a lighter texture, a lighter baked cake, which are the characteristics that we associate with a yellow cake. Now, if you've made the full transition to a traditional foods kitchen and you actually have white whole wheat grain or white whole wheat berries, and you like to soak and sprout them and dry them and then grind them into your own sprouted white whole wheat flour, you can definitely use that in this recipe. And the same goes just for regular whole white wheat grain or white wheat berries. If you have them and you just want to grind them, you don't want to go through the process of turning them into a sprouted flour, but you just want to grind them and use that fresh flour, that's definitely a wonderful option. And I just want to share with you, because I don't want to confuse you, but I use the terminology wheat grain and wheat berry, especially for those of you who are new to cooking and baking and whole grains, so that you know what I'm talking about. You may be wondering, because I know I get a lot of questions about this, what's a wheat berry? But a wheat grain is generally called a wheat berry. Now, what if you just want to go ahead and use all-purpose flour in this particular mix? Yes, you can do that. And that is especially understandable if you're at the beginning of your journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. But speaking of all-purpose flour, if you've started incorporating some of the ancient grain flours into your kitchen in their all-purpose form, you can definitely use those as well. So for example, if you're using all-purpose einkorn flour or all-purpose spelt flour, you can definitely use that in this yellow make-ahead cake mix. And those are very good if you're making the transition to a traditional foods kitchen, because all-purpose einkorn flour and all-purpose spelt flour, even though they've had the bran and the germ sifted out of them, are more nutritious than the typical all-purpose flour that's made from modern-day wheat that you find at your grocery store. Einkorn flour, even in its all-purpose form, is actually quite high in beta-carotene. What you see gives fruits and vegetables their orange color. It also can give grain its orange color. And in the case of einkorn, it's very high in beta-carotene. And what's so great about using all-purpose einkorn flour in a yellow cake mix like this is that einkorn flour in its all-purpose form has a rather yellow tint to it. And so it's perfect for helping add more yellow color to your yellow cake. But for this version, I'm just going to use the white whole wheat flour, and I've got 2½ cups right here. Now to sift in the rest of the ingredients, I like to use my handy dandy mesh strainer here, and we're going to use 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and then we're going to use, let me just get the last little bits of this out of here, and then we're going to use 3/4 teaspoon of salt. And that's just a fine ground salt. You can use a table salt. I always have a fine ground sea salt on hand, but use whatever you have. And then what I've got here is just 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. And I'm just gonna work these through the strainer so that we don't have any lumps or bumps. Okay, now what I've got here is my sucanat, but as we did with the chocolate cake mix, I've ground this up into a powdered form of sucanat. Now, if you skip this step in the chocolate cakes mix, that's okay. With chocolate cake, it's not the end of the world. However, with this yellow cake mix, you do not want to skip this step. Whatever sweetener you use, in terms of a whole sweetener, like a sucanat, or if you use a maple sugar or a coconut sugar or a date sugar, you want to make sure that you pulverize this into its powdered form. And even if you're making it with white granulated sugar, making this mix with white granulated sugar, which you can do, especially if you're at the beginning of slowly transitioning to a traditional foods kitchen, I highly recommend that you use powdered sugar, or you take your white granulated sugar and grind it into a powdered sugar. Because when you use your sugar in a powdered form, your final mix resembles something much more similar to what you would find in a box mix at the grocery store, but much healthier. And you also do wind up with a better product since you're not able to cream your butter and sugar together before adding the rest of your wet ingredients and making your cake batter. So I recommend doing this no matter what cake mix you're making. However, it's especially important for the yellow cake mix because first of all, it just blends better and it is distributed more evenly with the flour to help maintain the lighter yellow color, and you just get a much nicer end product. And I wanted to mention about the end product, all of these mixes make a 2-layer cake. Now, just like we did with the chocolate cake mix, we really want to give this a good whisk around to make sure that everything is well incorporated, and there are no little, it's a little more difficult to see in this one because this is a very light cake mix, but if there are little white spots, you'll see them kind of jumping out at you. And just, take about 30 to 60 seconds to just keep whisking it to make sure that everything is well incorporated, because having that baking powder, having that baking soda, having that salt well incorporated with your flour and your sweetener is really going to make, again, like with so many things with baked goods, going to make all the difference in the world with your final cake product. Now I've just got another quart-size canning jar, but use whatever jar you have. And I've got my funnel, and I'm just going to start ladling this cake mix, this nice yellow cake mix, into my jar. And again, as you do this, flying around, just give it a shake or a little tap just to help everything compress so that you can fit the whole mix in your jar. Now we'll put our lid on, and our yellow cake mix is all ready for our pantry or to give as a gift. And now we're going to move on to making our Make-Ahead spice cake mix, our healthy spice cake mix. Well, for the spice cake mix, we're going to need 2 cups of whole wheat flour. And this is just your regular whole wheat flour from the grocery store. But you can certainly use any flour that you want. If you want to use that white whole wheat that maybe you used for your yellow cake mix, you can definitely do that. If you have sprouted flours, you can definitely use that as well. But like chocolate cakes, spice cakes also lend themselves very well to whole grain flours as well as whole sweeteners. So if you are going all with whole grains, great. But if you're at the beginning of your transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you want to do half whole grain flour and half all-purpose flour, you can definitely do that. Now again, I'm going to sift everything in through the strainer, and we're going to definitely use our powdered sugar. It's just a sucanat that I've ground into a powder, and I highly recommend doing this. And the other ingredients that we're going to need are baking powder, baking soda, and salt. And for our spice mix, we're going to have some cinnamon, some allspice, and some cloves. And again, with all of these mixes, I'll have all the exact ingredients over in the printable recipe on my website. But let's go ahead and put in our baking powder. And that's just a teaspoon. And then we've got 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. And then we've got a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. And we'll just use our spatula just to get all the little lumps out. They're in good shape. Now, oh, I've got a little baking powder left behind in here. I want to make sure I get all of that in. Now we'll go ahead and add in our spice mix. Got that lovely cinnamon and allspice and the cloves, just wonderful. You can also add some nutmeg if you like. I don't like nutmeg, so I tend to leave that out, but I love allspice and cloves, along with cinnamon, which is my favorite. And they just add wonderful flavor to this cake. Alrighty, excellent. Now, our ground sucanat, or powdered sucanat. Again, whole sweeteners lend themselves wonderful to a spice cake. You know, it's just all those spices, just like in the case with the chocolate, those are very prominent or dominant flavors. And so it helps, to a certain extent, I don't want to say mask the flavor, because I like the flavor of sucanat and I like the flavor of whole grains. But when you are making that transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you're not used to these rich flavors of these whole sweeteners or the rich flavors of whole grains, it can take a little getting used to for your palate, especially when you're feeding children, or my husband would say, or feeding husbands. But it does take a little time for your palate to get used to these, more stronger flavors. And so if you want to use half all-purpose flour and half whole grain flour, or if you want to use initially using white sugar, but then maybe transitioning to half white sugar and a half whole sugar like a sucanat, or one of the others that I mentioned earlier like the maple sugar and so on and so forth, you can definitely do that. The most important thing is to do this slowly, so that you're introducing these new tastes slowly, so that everybody can get used to them and then eventually really like them, and not say, oh, is this made with something different or something like that. If you introduce it slowly and you introduce and you just start incorporating these ingredients partially in your recipes, no one will initially notice, and then over time you can put in a little more. And then people really grow to appreciate the wonderful whole flavors, the wonderful richness of real foods. And so you will definitely be a success at this if you do this slowly. Now I'm just going to give this a really good whisk around. As I've said before, you want to just make sure that everything is very well incorporated. Now we've got our healthy make-ahead spice cake mix all ready for the pantry or to give as a gift. Now if you'd like more make-ahead mixes, including pancake mix, biscuit mix, cornbread brownies, a cream of soup make-ahead mix, and also all sorts of cookie make-ahead mixes, be sure to click on this video over here, and I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.